It's really great to be here. It is my first time, and I was so impressed by the beauty of the surroundings, but equally impressed with the great history and tradition of the Theosophical Society. And there was something I just loved that you put on the internet, on your website. You said you're interested in religion, the intersection of religion, science, and philosophy, and the unfolding potential for compassion, deeper understanding, and kindness. What more do we need in our country at this moment? I don't know if any of you watched the hearings today, but it was certainly some kind of a turning point. I don't know whether it will be for the good or ill, but it was certainly quite something to see. And so compassion, understanding, and kindness is what we are in dire need of right now in our country. And the Theosophical Society is helping to build that. Because we've come from, maybe we've come after work or after dinner, we've come from different parts, perhaps, of the Chicago metro area. I know I came in this afternoon from central Illinois. I live in the Bloomington-Normal area now. I spent most of my career in Chicago. I've actually been thinking about this evening and thinking about all of you for many, many months now. As I always like to point out, I don't speak on the art of pausing out of any wealth of wisdom that I possess, but out of the poverty of my own struggle to understand what it means to live a more mindful life, a more contemplative life, a life where I can practice the art of pausing and still be a woman of action. The other day, my husband showed me a funny little cartoon, and you see this little man sitting there, and he says, "What a busy world this is. In the next 5 minutes, I will do nothing." And of course, you see him sitting silently, quietly for the next 2 frames. Well, in the 4th frame, he looks up and says, "Maybe I should Twitter about this." Well, in those 4 short frames, that little cartoon sums up the conundrum of life in the age of Twitter and cell phones and Facebook and texting and Instagram and Snapchat and Pinterest and all the other white noise, as I like to call it, that infiltrates our days. But I believe that at the center of every person is a point of being that longs for silence and solitude. Like many of you, I suspect, I suffer from a dual diagnosis: workaholism and overachieverism. And it began very early in my career, when at the age of 21, I was hired as a staff writer for the Washington Post. And then I went on to an even bigger newspaper, the Wall Street Journal. In those days, I was like a champion sprinter in a constant race to claim my prize. And the prizes did come. Someone mentioned some of them in the introduction. John did. And they would feel good for a week, maybe 2. And then the feeling would fade as I looked back into the rearview mirror and sped on to the next big award, the next big achievement. And sometimes in those years, it felt to me not as if I had a life that included my job, but a job that happened to include my life. But if we are very lucky in life, we arrive at a moment or series of moments that launch us on a journey of discovery toward what really matters. For me, I can't really talk about the art of pausing without telling you about an experience I had at a monastery on a hill in the heart of America's heartland. In the spring of 2007 was a pivotal time for me. I had been married only a short time at that point, and my marriage was an incomparable blessing. But I struggled as a second wife to create a relationship with my 2 adult stepdaughters, who were none too happy to have this new person in their lives, and who also were taking the measure of me as I was taking the measure of them. Professionally, I had just published my first book, 20 Poems to Nourish Your Soul, and that was another blessing. But it also meant I began receiving invitations to talk all over the country. And so I would do my day job at that time at PBS TV during the week, and then on the weekends I would travel to do presentations on touching the sacred through poetry, discovering inner wisdom through poetry, and topics like that. One of the places that invited me to speak was the Sophia Retreat Center at Mount St. Scholastica Monastery in Atchison, Kansas. Atchison, Kansas, a city I'd never even thought about before, much less visited. And the trip to Atchison, to the monastery, came after a particularly hectic spate of work and travel. And I arrived at the monastery on a Saturday evening exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. In fact, I felt like a fraud. I wondered how I was going to stand up in front of a retreat group the next morning and talk about nourishing the soul when I hadn't fed my own soul a decent meal in weeks. The morning I was to give my presentation, I happened to sit down in the monastery's main chapel, this lovely oak-lined chapel, smelling of candle wax and the oak wood. Sunlight poured in through these beautiful, distinctive blue stained glass windows, and silence seemed to saturate the room. And I looked up in front of me at the window that was right there above me. And there was St. Benedict, the founder of Western monasticism, with outstretched arms. And surrounding him were some words in Latin. Omni tempore silentio debent studere. I reached back in memory to the Latin I had to take at Catholic high school, and I was able to do a rough translation of omni tempore silentio debent studere. At all times, cultivate silence. Suddenly, the paradox I had been living was staring me in the face. I had been running around the country, talking and talking, trying to help other people live a more contemplative life, when what was missing in my own life were moments of silence and solitude, when I could simply listen and be. And without them, I was losing drop by drop the inner reserves I needed to do the work I love, but also to cultivate an interior life. Later, I came across a little poem written by the great Trappist monk Thomas Merton called In Silence. And this poem made a great deal of sense to me now. He says, "Be still. Listen to the stones of the wall. Be silent. They try to speak your name. Listen to the living walls. Who are you? Who are you? Whose silence are you?" As busy people, as people of action, can we make even a small space within each of our days for silence, for listening to the stones in the wall, as Merton puts it? What are they saying? How are they calling our names? Ever since that day in the chapel, I've thought a lot about how to balance my active life with being quiet, being mindful, being more aware. Merton wrote that contemplation is life itself, fully active, fully awake, fully aware that it is alive. Fully active, fully awake, fully aware that it is alive. Here in the U.S., we get the active part. We're not so good at being fully awake, fully aware, and fully alive. We think we have to be busy every second, and that represents being fully alive. The Europeans may have something to teach us. Their workers receive 5 weeks of vacation each year. They're able to take off the week between Christmas and New Year's so they can travel to be with family and friends. They seem to understand leisure is essential. I would go so far as to say leisure is holy. But I can tell you that as a recovering workaholic, I didn't always think or live that way. As I mentioned, for several years I worked at the Wall Street Journal, 6 years in the Chicago Bureau, and 2 years in London. And in London, we had an office on the famous Fleet Street where all the British newspapers had offices, and our office was on the 10th floor. And I was fortunate enough to have a desk near a window that overlooked the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. And I'd arrive for work around 9 in the morning, turn on the computer, and promptly bury myself in the day's news wires and pick up the phone and start calling my sources to flesh out my news story for the day. And invariably, at some point, I would look out the window and it would be dark. The day had passed and I'd missed it. I was like the narrator in a lovely little poem by A.R. Ammons, interestingly enough called Eyesight, in which he says, "It was May before my attention turned to spring. In my word, I said to the southern slopes, I've missed it." So the poet decides to travel north to the northern slopes, where spring is not so far along yet, in the hopes of seeing still the first blush of the season. But he warns at the end of the poem, "It's not that way with all things. Some that go are gone. Some that go are gone." Can we challenge ourselves, even in the midst of our busy days, to practice the art of pausing, to stop, to look, clear the mind of work concerns, and pay attention to the mystery, the wonder that is all around us in creation, knowing that we can pause and still be productive. Thomas Merton said that living a more contemplative life comes down to 3 tiny words: now, here, and this. Now, living in this moment, here, exactly where we are, with our mind on this, exactly what we're doing. Now, here, this. When I worked at the Wall Street Journal, the mantra trickling down from the main office in New York was always more, better, better. We were supposed to do more stories and better stories. Speed and productivity are 2 of the defining words of the past 2 centuries. But as with most ideas, our thinking is beginning to swing in the opposite direction. There was an interesting series of TED Talks on NPR not too long ago on the topic of procrastination. And one of the speakers was Adam Grant, author of a new book a relatively new book now, called Originals, that explores how innovative new businesses come to be. And one of the things Grant discovered, big surprise, is that people who press the pause button on their idea for a business to let it germinate for a while in the fallow recesses of the mind started some of the most successful businesses. And one of the businesses he features in his book is Warby Parker, the online eyeglass company. Grant points out that even when we're not working on a task, it's still active in the mind. And that's when an idea begins to incubate. He says procrastination, and here I would substitute the word pausing, gives you, quote, time to consider divergent ideas, to think in non-linear ways and make unexpected leaps. He coined this idea that is the opposite of déjà vu. Déjà vu is when you think you're seeing the same thing over and over again. But vujade, as he calls it, is when you look at something you've seen many times before and all of a sudden see something new in it with eyes that would not have seen as freshly if there had been no pause, no in-between time to ponder, to relax, to nurture, to incubate. When was the last time you took even 10 minutes to just do nothing? 10 minutes of no email, no texting, no internet, no chatting, no eating, not even reading. On that same TED radio hour, Andy Puddicombe, a former monk, noted that this constant whirl of activity is the way we miss out on the things that are most important to us. And the crazy thing is, he says, everybody assumes that's the way life is, so we just have to get on with it. Only it isn't. And we don't. There are, in fact, many ways to practice the art of pausing. Here's just one of them. Jonathan Montaldo, the theologian and Merton scholar, wrote a series of books called Bridges to Contemplative Living. And in one of them, the one I like the best of the series, he talks about writing a holy sentence every day. Writing a holy sentence every day. So every day, I try to write a 3-line poem, a Japanese haiku. Do you all remember the haiku from grammar school or from high school? Japanese haiku. It's hard to write a poem. It would be hard to write a poem a day, but 3 lines I can handle. 3 lines anybody can handle. But interestingly enough, it is a meditation practice I learned from my friend, Brother Paul Quinnen, who is a monk at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky, Thomas Merton's abbey. He writes a 3-line haiku every day as part of his meditation practice. And for 3 years, he and I exchanged a haiku a day, and it was a lot of fun, and it became our book, The Art of Pausing. So now I find myself pausing periodically during my day, looking around, listening for what will be my 3 lines. And writing those 3 lines gives me a better sense of having lived the day. In some ways, this little practice resembles a tradition among African tribesmen who lead safaris. They stop periodically on the journey and sit quite still, listening to the beating of the heart. They say they are trying to allow their souls to catch up with them on the journey. Sooner or later, we all have to let our souls catch up with the rest of our lives. Well, maybe haiku isn't your thing. But what about simply walking? The writers, Charles Dickens and C.S. Lewis, walked several miles a day. So did the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. I walked myself into my best thoughts, Kierkegaard wrote. And Steve Jobs of Apple Computers used to have these famous walking meetings with his executives. Solvitur ambulando, solvitur ambulando. We solve it by walking. How else can we practice the art of pausing? When I returned to the monastery, Mount St. Scholastica in Atchison, one of my favorite places to visit is the Grape Vines. The grapes are among the oldest residents of the monastery. They date back to the 1800s when the first sisters came down from Minnesota to Atchison. Anybody a gardener here? Nobody? Yeah, a little bit. Well, then you might know that grapevines are wonderful plants. They'll grow and grow and grow without much effort. But they won't produce anything of value without the careful touch of the vine dresser's hand that has to reach in periodically and cut back the branches so that the grapes can get the sunlight and the nutrients they need. Too many branches dilute what the grapes need to really thrive. Now, there's another window in that chapel I mentioned at Mount St. Scholastica Monastery. And this window shows kind of a branch coming out of a trunk coming out of the earth. But it's kind of been lopped off, and there's some fresh shoots coming out of that branch. And surrounding that image are some more words in Latin. Succissa virescit. Cut back, it will grow stronger. For someone like me, who's always running around, trying to do 5 things at once, be all things to all people, it's a reminder to periodically slow down, to survey the grapevine that's my life, and to cut back on what's non-essential, what's not nourishing my soul. And what is essential? That's the big question, right? Well, I love a film from the 1980s, perhaps some of you know it, called Awakenings. And it's the story of a doctor, played by Robin Williams, as you can see, who develops a drug that reawakens patients, like Robert De Niro over there, who have been asleep for decades in a post-encephalitic coma. And once conscious again, the patients revel in the most mundane of activities, like shaving, being read to, sharing a meal across the table with someone. They remind everyone on the hospital staff what a joy it is to experience the ordinary things of life. But eventually, the drug wears off, and the patients slip back into their catatonic state. And Robin Williams, the doctor, has to stand up in front of his colleagues and explain what went wrong. And he says, we can say the drugs weren't strong enough, or the patients were too sick. But he says what we learned out of this failure was something far more important. And it is this: that the human heart is more powerful than any drug. And that's what needs to be nourished with work, play, friendship, family. These are the things that matter, he says. These are the things we've forgotten. The simplest things. Sukchisa varesit. Cut back. It will grow stronger. Can we find the courage to cut back on what's non-essential to nourishing our souls and focus on what really matters? The simplest things. I'll end reading a little passage from my book, The Art of Pausing, Meditations for the Overworked and Overwhelmed, which I wrote with Brother Paul, and a Disciples of Christ minister who also began exchanging a haiku a day with us. So we had this trio going for a long time. When I'm looking around for what will be my 3-line poem for the day, I often find those lines staring me in the face. In the natural world, they're almost looking for me. I'm looking for them, but those lines are also looking for me. So here is a kind of ending benediction, is a 3-line haiku I wrote one day and the short reflection that goes with it. Okay. Cicada crawls up side of building, brick by brick. No deadlines to meet. Okay? Cicada crawls up side of building, brick by brick. No deadlines to meet. Here's the little reflection. Whenever I write, I like to aim my desk toward a window so I can glimpse the world outside. One day, as I sat typing in a Benedictine monastery, in a room on the 3rd floor, I spied a cicada climbing the side of the building. At the pace it was going, it probably would take a couple of hours to inch up just 2 bricks. The cicada didn't seem in a hurry. It progressed, bit by bit. The Benedictine motto is ora et labora, pray and work. But Benedictines seem to know when it is time to quit both. They even dare to call leisure holy. Late one evening, seeing a light on in my room, the prioress of the monastery knocked on my door. She invited me to shut down my computer and join her and some visiting prioresses for a glass of wine and some snacks. Stupidly, I said no and kept right on working. The Benedictine writer Macrina Whitaker urges us to pause several times a day during the course of our work to allow our souls to catch up with the rest of our lives. Or, as the White Rabbit, that great philosopher in Alice in Wonderland, says, don't just do something, stand there. I admired that cicada for its leisurely pace. It forced me to pause in the midst of my work and reminded me that pauses, just like work, can be sacred. May all of your pauses, all of your work, and all of your days be sacred. Thanks for your kind attention this evening, and thanks be to God.
So, do you think you can have both worlds together where you're that hyperactive. Like I get a lot of joy out of being busy and accomplishing things. But if I bring pause into my life, can they both coexist, or do I have to cut that stuff out?
No, I firmly believe both can coexist, but you have to be intentional about it. I'm on leave for my work with NPR right now, but it's a pretty fast-paced life when I'm in the newsroom. And so I know that periodically during my day, I have to either escape to a quiet room, sometimes it's the stairwell, and sometimes it's a place in my mind. I think it's important for all of us to have a place we can go in our minds when we can't get away from the maddening crowd, like in an airport, for example, or on a plane, or riding a train. I think you have to have a place you go to in your mind. And for me, it's this spot that I remember from my childhood where there was this little wooden bench underneath a fig tree that my grandfather planted in our backyard. And it's where I used to go as a little kid to sort of just think and daydream, and sometimes I would write poems in this little spot. But I go back there in my mind if I can't find a physical space to escape to. But the point is to be very intentional about it. And Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker, and she lived in a whirlwind all the time. I mean, there were people coming and going from the Catholic Worker all the time, often mentally ill people, homeless people. And she would say, when you're in the midst of that worst, whirlwind, that's the time to pause. When you're right, when it's like really bad, that's the time to pause. And I often think of that, what Dorothy Day said, so I hope that helps.
In order to pause, how necessary is it to have a place of physical silence where there are no sounds versus, let's say in the workplace, it might be noisy?
Yeah, I think it is important. As I was telling your friend there, sometimes we can't always find that silent place. I mean, we're trapped in an airplane or something, or a train. And I mean, I think it's important to have also a place that you can go for silence. I mean, luckily, when I lived in downtown Chicago, there were lots of churches all around. There's a church on almost every corner in Chicago, and you could just dash in there. Here, if you live in this area, you have how many acres here? 42. 42 acres of silence. I mean, sometimes it's right there, and we're just not thinking about it, but it's right in front of our face. So yes, I also think it's really important to go to places like Mount St. Scholastica Monastery. Here, we're very lucky. We have 2 Benedictine monasteries in Lisle, St. Procopius and Sacred Heart. And anybody can go there as a guest and do a private retreat. You can join in the prayer life of the community. And there's St. Scholastica in Rogers Park in Chicago. So we're quite fortunate that we have actual monasteries in this area. And 3 of them, so. But there are other retreat houses too. I mean, the Senecal Sisters have a place on Fullerton, which is quite nice as well. How do you all pause and find your contemplative moments? Yeah. I think your friend is volunteering you.
I just got a puppy last year in December, and I had a wonderful afternoon today just walking the dog and just taking everything in silence and enjoying the weather, enjoying being healthy and everything like that. And I find that time, I work from home, so it's my way to get out and interact with the world. And I just adore that time. It's my puppy walking time.
Yeah, your puppy walking time is your contemplative time. Yeah.
All right. So for me, my thing has always been I love the sunrise. To me, that is just on a religious note, it's God's promise for a new hope, new day. But in any case, my problem is that I always walk this one path in my neighborhood, and it makes me really mad because there was an incident on the path just recently, and so now it goes back to this whole thing of walk in pairs. Well, that breaks my silence. That was my carved out time. That was sacred time for me. And so it makes me mad that the world is the way it is, where you can't find sometimes that solitude that that was what made me tick. And I have to rethink that now. So
can you walk in silence with your partner? Can you agree to be silent?
But it's not the same, because then it starts the conversation and all that. And next thing you know, you're talking about with bills, And it's like, no, that was taking in nature, taking in the sunrise. That was everything to me. So I have to figure out how to make that come back in my life, because And it might be just a risk that I'm willing to take because it's so important to me,
Yes. Well, or come on over here to the Theosophical Society. They've got a safe space for you.
Anyone else would like to share? Well, I'd like to share.
Yes.
I feel very blessed to be working here at the Theosophical Society because, as I showed when we walked around, we do have a meditation room, and the organization is, good enough to give us 15 minutes of working time to go into that meditation room and begin the day in silence. And for those who want to, they can come early and extend that. And it's actually open 24 hours a day, not to the general public, to the staff. And there are many other places of this nature. Just a couple of weeks ago, we visited the Science of Spirituality. Now I'm giving them a plug as well. They're in Naperville. They've just built a beautiful center. But there they have a meditation room, and it's open, and they say that anybody can go in there and sit. And I'm sure that churches and various other religious centers would have that as a possibility.
Now, I can imagine workplaces, beginning the day with 5-10 minutes of silence. The way the Quakers, the kids in the Quaker schools have to begin their day with, I think it's a half hour of silence, but just 10 minutes. Imagine that on Wall Street. Imagine the stockbrokers and the arbitrageurs and everybody beginning their day with silence. I wonder if we would have had the economic meltdown of 2008 if that was happening. But there's a lot we can do, but it has to start with us. Before we can start changing the world, we have to transform our own selves.